This is the second open Zoom seminar of our research initiative, Interactive Histories, Co-Produced Communities, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I am Katharina Hayden from the University of Bern in Switzerland. And together with David Nierenberg, director of the IIS Princeton, I am co-leading this project. And we are happy to see all of you here today. It is our goal in this project to discover and discuss moments of what we call co-production in the entangled histories of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, both in real life and in thought, and both conscious and unconscious co-productions. In our open Zoom seminars, we invite scholars from different fields and places to present their own research on such religious co-production. And we are very happy to have Michael Pregill today. A special welcome to you, Michael, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. When reading your works, I was thrilled to encounter so many questions and considerations and concepts we also think about intensively in our conversations in the research group. And so I'm very much looking forward to your talk and our discussion. Our group, that is 7 postdoctoral researchers based in Princeton and Bern, 13 academic collegium members from very different places, and all of you, of course, at least for today and hopefully also in the future. One of the postdoctoral researchers is Gillian Stinchcomb, who will introduce and moderate this seminar. And David, if you would like to say a word, so please, and if not, I hand over to Gillian.
No, my only word is thank you to Michael Pregill for joining us. The first seminar was wonderful, and the second one is going to be wonderful. And all of you who are here, I think, are in for a treat.
All right. And I just want to echo Katarina and David in saying thank you so much to everyone for being here today. I am thrilled to introduce our speaker today, whose really wide-ranging book and interpersonal generosity has really been formative in my own thinking, even at the sort of earliest stages of this project, when asked about good conversation partners, good recent books that we might read. Michael and Michael's work was one of the first things one of the first ideas that I had. So I'm really thrilled that this worked out, and then he gets to be our second speaker for this. So just to give a bit of a more formal introduction, Michael Pregill is a scholar of comparative religion, focusing on the scriptural cultures of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Much of his research focuses on the reception of biblical Jewish and Christian traditions in the Quran and Islam. His monograph, The Golden Calf Between Bible and Quran, Scripture, Polemic, and Exegesis from Late Antiquity to Islam, was the recipient of the 2021 American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in the Textual Studies category. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow of the European Research Council Synergy Project, the European Quran, writing a new book entitled The Jewish Matrix of Islam, Abraham Geiger and the Foundation of Western Quranic Studies. He's taught at numerous institutions, most recently the University of California, Los Angeles, Stonehill College, Chapman University, and the University of Oklahoma. He's going to speak with us today about the past, present, and future of Quranic studies, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic legacies, which engages with material from his book and current project. And just to give a little roadmap of what we're going to do, Michael's going to speak for 40 to 50 minutes, and he has a PowerPoint that he's going to share with us. And at the end of that, if you could either send a quick message in the chat or use the raise hand function, I will moderate, and we'll just go in order based on what we see, especially in the chat, and we'll go from there to start our conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much to the organizers for this warm invitation and gracious commentary on my previous work. Yeah, so as Jill noted, oh, excuse me, and of course, that's better. Okay. So as Jill noted, I'm currently on the second year of a 2-year fellowship with the ERC Synergy Project, the European Quran, writing a book investigating this question of the Jewish background to the Quran and Islam in Western scholarly imagination, and specifically looking at this through the lens of the groundbreaking work of Abraham Geiger. So in my talk, there'll be at least at the beginning, I'll strongly foreground Geiger and his work, though as you will see, I'm actually trying to probe much larger questions in working on Geiger, and so much great work has already been done on Geiger, right? So I'm definitely not trying to reinvent the wheel in my research, but rather again try to build on the work of titans such as Susanna Heschel in particular, in trying to think about Geiger's legacy for research today. So of course he probably needs no introduction for this audience, but Geiger, born in 1810, dies in 1874. Of course, he's a German Jewish rabbi who's best known as one of the founding figures of what was in his day called liberal Judaism, but here in the US we call Reform. Geiger was a vocal and influential spokesman for the modernization of Jewish practice and belief, focusing on ethics or rationality rather than ritual, right, as the core of religion. As a scholar, Geiger is best known for his seminal work on the historical Jesus, the Jewish background to Christianity. Essentially, Geiger pioneers the view that Jesus was Jewish, right? And so his message should be fundamentally understood in the context of first century Jewish thinking and concerns. This is, of course, not a radical proposition to us today, but Geiger was, of course, deeply opposed to the view of Jesus promoted by Christian theology in his time, which saw Jesus as breaking away from Judaism and deliberately founding a new religion, right? Now, strikingly, though he was ordained as a rabbi, had the requisite training from a Jewish seminary, Geiger's PhD thesis is actually, of course, in Islamic studies, right? He did graduate work in what in his time was called Orientalistic, right? Oriental studies. And he wrote a thesis that I've argued is really the first modern work of Quranic studies in the West. And so one of the most important works in Quranic studies ever, or at least in the 19th century. And this is his thesis submitted to the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Bonn in 1832, subsequently published in 1833, entitled Was hat Muhammad aus dem Judentum aufgenommen? What did Muhammad borrow from Judaism? Amazingly, Geiger was 23 at the time the book was published. He had, of course, written his first book on rabbinic law when he was 17. My first book came out just before I turned 49, but as we say, better late than never. So there is, of course, a lot going on in Geiger's project. But to start, let me say that in broad cultural terms, right, what's most significant in Geiger's work is the argument that Muhammad's religious message should be taken seriously. And in particular, that Muhammad is not a con man, liar, or charlatan. This is important in Geiger's context because in the 19th century, before Geiger, it's the standard view of most Europeans that Muhammad was a fake, right? Muhammad had pretended to be a prophet and tricked his followers in order to organize a new religion that would provide a path to worldly power. I think Alfonsi actually says like a path by which to be made a king. Right? Now, as I'll explain in a little bit, among Europeans, this view of Muhammad as charlatan goes back to the Middle Ages, but it actually emerges even further back in the 7th century among Christians of the Middle East, whose communities were subsumed under Islamic rule after the Arab conquests. By the Middle Ages, European texts were replete with stories and images depicting Muhammad in various unflattering ways, as in the popular and much illustrated tale of how Muhammad trained a particularly handsome bull to carry his false scripture around on its horns to impress his credulous followers. John Tolan has worked on this. Why having the bull prance around with your fabricated scripture on its horns would be particularly compelling, I can't really say, but this is the tradition that we find in ample evidence in the Middle Ages and early modern period. So in contrast to this, right, this view of Muhammad as a con man, excuse me, Geiger characterizes Muhammad as a sincere religious enthusiast, right, a schwärmer. People love to point out to me that in modern German, of course, like the term schwärmer tends to mean like zealot, fanatic, right? It can often connote something negative. But if you read Geiger's work, right, it's quite clear from his writing that Geiger means this in a positive sense, right? He doesn't go so far as to characterize Muhammad as a true prophet, but Geiger sees Muhammad as motivated by the genuine conviction that he's conveying a divine message to humanity. In Geiger's words, and quoting here, Muhammad is a genuine enthusiast who was himself thoroughly convinced of his divine mission. Giving Muhammad the benefit of the doubt in this way has this effect of transmuting the Western academic study of Islam's origins from religious polemic into a more objective or scientific discourse. Now, Geiger's view certainly had its opponents in his time, right? In 1835, Geiger's book is reviewed by the leading figure of French Orientalism of the day, right? This is Antoine Sébastien de Sacy. Today, Sébastien de Sacy is probably best known for being the teacher of Champollion, who translated the Rosetta Stone. But of course, in his day, Sébastien de Sacy was like the big dog of Oriental studies in France. And so, of course, that's that terrifying thing of when a really senior scholar reviews your first book. That's what happened to Geiger. Sébastien de Sacy insisted that Muhammad was, and I quote here, was nothing but a skilled impostor, premeditated in all his actions and cold-bloodedly evaluating all that which favored and assured the success of his ambitious projects. Now, I would contrast that with the statement of Alois Sprenger a number of decades later, or about 30 years after Geiger, who offers what seems to be, at first blush, a similarly negative portrayal. In his 1861 biography, Sprenger gives us this, right? Sprenger says, burning enthusiasm paired with low cunning, pure sacrifice for a higher aim with mean selfishness, indulgence, even dependence upon others with obstinacy, devotion with treachery. Those are a few of the contradictory psychic qualities of Muhammad's character. Now, this is likewise not very flattering, right? But it's certainly worth pointing out that Sprenger here is at least acknowledging Muhammad's burning enthusiasm, right? Muhammad was sincere, right? This is to say that within a generation after the publication of his work, Geiger's perspective on the prophet has had an effect even on Muhammad's detractors, right? Geiger has very rapidly shifted the discourse. This is to say nothing of the fact that starting already in the 1830s, there's a shift towards more positive depictions of the prophet that starts to gain traction in Europe thanks to Geiger. But again, even Europeans with a negative attitude come to abandon the notion of Muhammad as a con man and a trickster. So what's at stake in all of this, right? Why are scholars so concerned with this question of Muhammad's psychological disposition and motivations, right? Why is this rabbi in the 1830s so concerned to defend Muhammad, right, against Christian attacks, and for that matter, devoting this book to the thesis that Muhammad derived Islam from Judaism? My current project is really trying to unpack some of these fundamental questions, explaining the purpose and background of Geiger's work, why it's so important for Quranic studies, not just for how the field develops in the 19th and 20th centuries, but also and especially for how we continue to think about and approach the Quran today, right? So in talking about my project and some of the approaches I'm taking, hopefully, as we go, you'll see that, as has already been mentioned, that there's a kind of a symmetry or a lot of parallelism between the themes that I'm touching on in my project and that which your Interactive Histories project is focusing on. So at the outset, let me emphasize something, which is that the Western tradition, this is obvious, but the Western tradition of engaging with the Quran and Islam, right, the tradition that we usually call Orientalism, this is very frequently contrasted with native Muslim perspectives on the Quran. Some go so far as to see Orientalism as a strategy of domination, a reflex of imperialism, right? A discourse meant to denigrate and demolish Islam, right? An intellectual counterpart to political and economic strategies of domination. This is the notion of Orientalism that's popularized, of course, by Edward Said's widely influential study of 1978. And this characterization is certainly accurate for some aspects of the Orientalist tradition from the 19th century up to the present day. But I would argue that, at least where the Quran is concerned, the dominant modern Western approach to the Quran that's established by Geiger, his contemporaries and followers, this approach actually shares a lot in common with Muslim approaches. In this, it's perhaps not accidental that Geiger was Jewish, right? Because it's often been argued, as in the Kalmar Penclar book, that Jewish scholars of Islam in Europe occupy a unique place in European intellectual history because Jews have often been seen as somehow both Oriental and Occidental, right? They're often seen as Europe's internally colonized Orientals, and so they have a particular kind of cultural proximity to Islam. So one could argue that scholars like Geiger are looking at Islam from the outside, but at the same time are perhaps better able to see or imagine what Islam is like from the inside. This again is I think a thread in the contemporary historiography on Jewish Orientalism. Now, again, so overall, what I think I'd be inclined to argue at this point is that the Orientalist view of the Quran, especially that promoted by Geiger, and the traditional Muslim view of the Quran are actually deeply connected, right? They run in parallel tracks. There are certainly some audiences before which I could imagine floating this thesis and not getting a very warm reception. But here I'm going to try to argue that Geiger's approach, and so Western Quranic studies on the whole, is deeply Jewish on some level, and also deeply Christian, but also from another perspective, deeply Islamic. Right, all three of these elements kind of come together in Geiger's project and continue to shape Western scholarship on the Quran today. And so, I guess in your terms, I would say that Quranic studies is in some ways a meta co-production of the Islamic tradition on the Quran. But history will be my judge. So, given the nature of this audience, I'm going to assume, of course, that everybody's familiar with the conventional account of Islamic origins, particularly the conventional kind of frame narrative of the origins of the Quran and the mission of Muhammad between 610 and 632. And also would assume, of course, that like most of you, if not all of you, are familiar, at least in broad terms, with the modern critique of this narrative, right? The various historiographic issues surrounding the origins of Islam, especially beginning with the critique of the revisionists in the 1970s, and then reactions against revisionism, and our current kind of state of detente between various camps. By the way, wonderful if you're curious as to the way this history has unfolded. There's a relatively new book by Munim Siri called Controversies over Islamic Origins that I think was just published last year. And it's a really terrific kind of survey of the issues, and as well as kind of issuing a kind of like both kind of professional, academic, and kind of more deep, like sort of theological, ecumenical challenge to scholars to try to work somewhat harder to find common ground between traditionalists and revisionists. Anyway, so in broad terms, the Islamic Empire is well established in Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, Iran, Egypt by the 660s, right? And I think contemporary work on the extant manuscript evidence attests to the fact that the Quran, as we know it, must be in circulation by this time, 650s, 660s. The catch that I think has not ever been resolved is that there's very little external evidence for most of what precedes this, right? I think the most radical perspective is that the life of Muhammad, the accounts of the revelation of the Quran, that they could very well be myth, right? That there's a narrative that's developed by later Muslim tradition to establish an origin story for the tradition and to locate Islam in the genealogy of Abrahamic religions, right? Scholars, I think, today are still kind of deeply divided on the question of how reliable the basic frame for where the Quran came from is. But I would underscore that from Geiger's time in the 1830s until about the 1980s, right, all Western scholars basically accept the basic account of Islam's origins that's proposed by the tradition itself, right? Being Christians and Jews, these European observers of Islam for the first 150 years of Orientalist tradition, they did not accept the idea that Muhammad had actually received the Quran from God, right, through Gabriel, because otherwise then they would actually be Muslims. But they did, by and large, accept the notion of Muhammad as the source of the Quran, right? That it often kind of just concluding that Muhammad had been the author, and that Muhammad's biography, by and large, conformed to the basic framework that's presented to us in Islamic sources. The question of Muhammad's sincerity comes up, right, in that Europeans often ask themselves, well, what kind of guy writes a scripture and founds an empire? What is his psychology like, right? Um, the prevailing view before Geiger is that Muhammad had been an opportunist with dreams of world domination. And here I would note that I often tell students that, or at least suggest that, this problematic view of Muhammad was popular in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries because so many European Christians themselves are opportunists with dreams of world domination, right? In the US, we call this projection distortion. It's when you accuse the person that you're opposed to of having the same agenda and motives as you do. So in other words, Europeans see Muhammad as a kind of a mirror and they see themselves, right? Anyway, Geiger says no to this, right? For Geiger, Muhammad means it when he portrays himself in the Quran as the messenger of God and seal of the prophets. Geiger thus agrees with the older European line that Muhammad was the human author of the Quran, but he's underscoring the theme of Muhammad's sincerity, right? The upshot being that Muhammad is, for Geiger, still a false prophet, but at least a well-intentioned one. So Geiger writes his thesis in response to a solicitation from the Oriental Studies faculty at the University of Bonn. That's not true. It's the philosophy faculty, but never mind. But the invitation from Bonn for this prize competition declares in Latin, right? Inquiritur in fontes al Qurani, qui ex judaismo derivandi sunt. We inquire regarding the sources of the Quran, which is derived from Judaism. Which is to say, Geiger does not originate the theme or the claim of the Jewish influence on Islam. He simply qualified in a way that no one else had been before him to demonstrate the truth of the proposition as he understands it, both philologically and historically. We can understand Geiger's approach simply by considering the chapter headings, right? And this is like an amazing kind of systematic exploration of the topic from every facet and angle, right? Did Muhammad wish to borrow from Judaism? Could Muhammad borrow from Judaism? Did Muhammad borrow from Judaism? Right, et cetera, et cetera. Geiger, of course, his answer to all these questions is yes, right? His understanding of Muhammad's fundamentally similar, again, to that of his predecessors, right? Muhammad is a pagan with political aspirations. He proclaims himself to be prophet. He borrows scriptural traditions from learned Jews and Christians as a way of proving his legitimacy. Geiger, of course, focusing on the question of the Jewish influence specifically. But again, the indispensable spin with Geiger is that Muhammad is actually convinced of his own authenticity, which for his time is, again, like progress, right? The problem, of course, is that Geiger's approach also then sets the stage for the prevailing methodology of so much future research that then overemphasizes Muhammad's debt to Judaism and Muhammad's kind of passive reception of other traditions, right? That I've called in some of my writings, I call this the influence paradigm. One could elaborate at length on what I mean. Okay, let me stop for a second. So I've already mentioned that from my perspective, Geiger is establishing a Quranic studies that is Jewish and Christian and Islamic, right? I've increasingly come to realize that there is a kind of a conspicuously Christian thrust in Geiger's work and approach. Okay, something I often emphasize for students is that there is this kind of ambivalence, right? That the Quran potentially triggers in a Jewish or Christian reader, and I noted with some amusement that ambivalence was one of you're in your white paper for this project. That ambivalence kind of came up as an important neologism. It's kind of interesting to me. But yeah, the Jewish or Christian reader, right, comes to the Quran and finds all this narrative material that, of course, parallel stories found in the Bible of Jews and Christians, but deviating in significant ways from the authoritative versions, right? Of course, we don't have to go through this. This audience will be very familiar with them, but there are so many famous examples of these deviations, right? Of course, some of these stories are known from Jewish and Christian apocryphal and legendary traditions, right? But the sources of other so-called deviations in the Quran remain obscure to this day, right? So again, there's this ambivalence. right? The stories about Adam or Noah or Abraham or Jesus in the Quran are familiar, but also kind of strange and deviant. Or if you're a Christian viewer in particular, maybe even heretical, right? This, of course, brings me to Bahira. Christians, I think in particular, are inclined to deal with and dispel ambivalence about the Quran by asserting that Muhammad had basically plagiarized it, right? Getting it all from Jews and heretics who acted as his informants while he was composing the Quran. This theme emerges very early after the rise of Islam among Christians who live under Islamic rule, right after the Arab conquest, as I've mentioned before. Some of these Christians write what I would call pseudo biographies of Muhammad that depict the prophet as a fraud and the teachings of Islam as vacuous and corrupt. Probably the most important is the Apology for Christianity that's ascribed to a courtier of the Abbasid Caliph named Abdul Masih Kindi, right, who purportedly lives in the 800s. It's actually not clear to me where the historiography on Kindi is right now. The identity of Kindi and the transmission of his text are kind of controversial. It's been suggested that Kindi is a pseudonym or an invented character, right? That he's like kind of a frame character for certain kinds of polemical apologetic tendencies. The text itself may be as late as the 10th century. It's all very unclear to me, and some people argue that, of course, Kindi, there's actually a historical Kindi who writes the Risala. Anyway, the text directly asserts that Muhammad fills the Quran with fables and fancies drawn from the teachings of human tutors, right? Is establishing a human source for the Quran and with Muhammad's borrowing and plagiarizing from his informants. The informants are identified as a heretical monk named Sergius and a pair of Jews identified as Abdullah and Ka'b, right? And these are the three major protagonists of this aspect of the Risala of Kindi. It does not take a lot of detective work to figure out who Sergius, Abdullah, and Ka'b are, right? These ancient pseudo biographies that were written by these Christians responding to the rise of Islam, right? They often relied on and were distortions of traditions that had been handed down by Muslims themselves, right? Your project prospectus, what I keep calling a white paper, focuses on Bahira, right? So of course, many of you already know how this process worked. But there are all of these Muslim accounts that probably date back as far as the early decades after the death of Muhammad, right? They portray the positive role that some Jews and Christians had played in the life of the prophet and the early community. So in some reports, right, there's this Christian monk named Bahira, who's then called Sergius in Syriac sources. But this monk is understood to have identified Muhammad as a kind of an anticipated prophet, right? When Muhammad was a child. And Bahira is clearly like this vision of Bahira clearly gives rise to the Christian polemical view of Sergius Bahira, right? Moreover, and what I would emphasize is that often in Islamic tradition, Jews in Medina who are friendly to Muhammad are depicted as accepting his teachings, recognizing the authenticity of the Quran, and then confirming that Muhammad's arrival as prophet is the fulfillment of prophecy, right? And two of these important figures, whom I've written about in their connection with what's called Israeliyat, the transmission of supposedly Jewish traditions in Islamic sources. These two figures, Abdullah ibn Salam and Ka'b al-Ahbar, right? These are the source of the Abdullah and Ka'b in Kindi, right? In any event, right? Eastern Christian polemical texts like that of Kindi, right? They're transmitted to Europe during the Middle Ages. They're translated into Latin, and then they circulate quite widely. And they provide the main basis for the view of Muhammad as a charlatan who had written the Quran as a false, corrupt law that had led the Arabs into perdition. The account of Kindi itself, I think, was extremely popular. It's included in the Corpus Tolitentum, which is this widely influential collection of Latin anti-Islamic writings produced by Peter the Venerable of Cluny, I think in the 1140s. The corpus includes, famously made the Latin translation of the Quran by Robert of Ketton, the Lex Muhammad Pseudo Propheta, and it also includes a translation of Kindi, and of course then the kind of polemical overview of Islam by Peter the Venerable himself, the Summa. I would note that the translation of Robert of Ketton, to go back to my first slide, the translation of Robert of Ketton in the manuscript, the main manuscript of the corpus, features this fanciful and obviously unflattering depiction of Muhammad as a fish, specifically a bearded fish, as a student pointed out to me. So, I mean, that kind of tells us the spirit in which the Corpus Tollantatum is offered to its public. Right? Anyway, numerous documents in the Corpus Tollantatum promote this myth of Jewish influence, right? We also have the more or less contemporary, or actually a little bit earlier, the account of Petrus Alfonsi in his dialogue against the Jews. John Toland wrote a lot about this. Toland emphasizes not only Muhammad's plagiarism of traditions from his Jewish and Christian informants, but really emphasizes mixture in particular, right? That the Quran is a kind of a unsavory commingling of all of these unreliable traditions and nefarious teachings. But again, the Risala of Kindi, I think, is particularly important. It's translated into English in the 19th century by Willem Muir, and it continues to circulate throughout the 19th century during the time that Geiger himself is writing, right? So I would think after reading your perspectives, I've been thinking a lot about the 19th century is this era of European Christian appropriation of these older traditions, which were themselves transmitted from the Christian East, and all of this, like in Bahira and all of these other aspects, as being a kind of a modern aspect of the kind of co-evolution and co-production of understandings of Islam in tandem with ultimately like an Islamic matrix, but then kind of distorting it, like going through several layers of distortion, like the various kind of broken mirrors of the Christian polemical tradition, and then ending up with Geiger, who is again like engaging in the kind of like co-production of knowledge about Islam. Again, I think most consequentially, right, for Geiger and his legacy, sources like the Risala of Kindi focus on the Jewish aspect of Muhammad's teachings in particular. This conception of the Quran, the origins of Islam, the outlook of Muhammad, this is widespread from the 12th through the 14th centuries, still current again in the 19th century, deeply, deeply embedded in the tradition of early Orientalism. For example, the notion of Jewish influence is very, very strongly advanced in the Quran edition, translation, and commentary of Ludovico Maracci, on whom Roberto Totoli has done a lot of work. Maracci dies in 1700. Maracci, in his commentary on the Quran, repeatedly refers to the sources of Muhammad's idiosyncratic, deviant teachings as the fables of the Jews. And this dovetails as well with certain kinds of like views of like the Talmud and its legacy in European Christian culture. I think that Maracci is kind of tapping into this notion of like the Talmud as this kind of wellspring of heresy and deviation, and then also kind of admingling that with the Kindi tradition, the pseudo-biographical tradition. A lot of vectors coming together here. But again, let me emphasize, the idea of the Quran as fundamentally borrowed from Jews, right? This is the background to Geiger's work. It's widely held among European intellectuals before his time. It's deeply entrenched in scholarly knowledge production in about Islam for centuries previous, for example, in Maracci. And it's the basis of the prize solicitation from the University of Bonn that Geiger is writing in response to, right? So the notion of Muhammad's debt to Judaism is writ large all in European Christian culture on the whole, but in Geiger's day. Geiger's project of demonstrating the Jewish roots of the Quran accepts and corroborates this premise, right? But then transforms the question of sources into something that has a little bit more scholarly respectability, right? But nevertheless, when we look at Geiger's work and this complicated background, this is a complex and somewhat troubling legacy, I think, that we have to grapple with. So that's the Christian background, right? It's not surprising to see that these vectors coalesce with Jewish elements in Geiger's work, because of course Geiger's, well, super Jewish, right? Geiger comes from a traditional Jewish background in Frankfurt. He's ordained as a rabbi. He participates very actively in Jewish life and debates in his time, right? He ends up in Berlin, where he eventually founds a new institution for Jewish learning, the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, in 1872. Geiger only lives for 2 years after that, but of course, after his time, the Hochschule plays really a central role in German research on Judaism for a number of decades until it's shut down by the Nazis in 1942. And I think that as a testament to Geiger's significance as a luminary in German Jewish culture and research, of course, then in 1999, when a new Jewish seminary is open in Germany for the first time in so many decades, of course, it's the Abraham Geiger College, right? Which is very appropriate. It's in Potsdam, right? It's not in Berlin, but still. Geiger, again, I really do not want to retread Susanna Heschel's fantastic work, right? Susanna is the touchstone for so much that I've done. But in Heschel's work in particular, right? Like Geiger's work on Christianity is much better known. It's much more widely commented on, right? Geiger's work on Christianity is of interest to me because I think that if we think about Geiger's later work on Christianity, we can see that he's kind of up to the same stuff. He's engaging in the same project in his early work on Islam, right? If we look at the agenda that's so clear in his work on Jesus, the New Testament, and Jewish-Christian relations later, then we can see the subtexts and currents that are informing his work on the Quran. As Heschel and other people have shown, right? Geiger's approach to Christianity aims at exposing Jesus not as the founder of a new religion, but rather as the epitome of the ethically minded Judaism that Geiger was himself trying to revive, right? This whole kind of approach to Jesus that sees like his Judaism as it's also the Judaism of the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees then provide the foundations for the rabbinic movement. So it's not just that the Christian portrayal of Judaism as deviant and obsolete is wrong, but it's actually that Jesus and the rabbis are united in their vision of an ethical religion that modern Judaism is the heir to, right? And it is actually Christianity that deviates from Jesus's vision, right? So Judaism as the vital source for Christianity, the essence, right? This is all over Geiger's later work. These themes clearly, this kind of thinking informs Geiger's work on the Jewish basis of Islam and the Quran, right? Which is a kind of dry run for the later, much more developed project on Judaism and Christianity, right? In the big picture, Geiger's view is that Judaism is the original and authentic ancestor of both its daughter religions, right? Christianity, Islam. Those traditions are recognized and enfranchised, right? They're given a genuine a role, but they're secondary, right? They bear a secondary relationship to the original authentic vision, which is epitomized by Judaism. The larger context, of course, of all of this, and other people know this much better than me, is the ongoing kind of legal and social emancipation of the Jews in various European countries and their colonies, right? Geiger's argument for the value and originality of Judaism is clearly an intellectual component of this process, or like complement to like this larger legal social reform movement. Anyway, but all of this explains Geiger's approach to Muhammad, I think, right? In particular, I've come to realize that this background is why Geiger needs Muhammad to be sincere, okay? He's trying to cast ancient Judaism as this wellspring of religious truth handed down from ancient Israel, preserved in the teachings of the rabbis, right? Muhammad has to be truly convinced of the value and vitality of those Jewish teachings in borrowing and repurposing them in the Quran. If Muhammad is just some scheming imposter, that is a bad look that corrodes Muhammad's appeal as a witness to the value of Judaism, right? So for Geiger, corroborating the relationship between Islam and Judaism, this does nothing if Muhammad is a con man, right? That if the authenticity and originality of Judaism are not demonstrated if Muhammad is a charlatan, right? So Muhammad's sincerity is instrumental. It supports and promotes this larger project of Geiger's of demonstrating the legitimacy of Judaism, right? And again, I would emphasize that the participants in your seminar will kind of recognize that in broader terms, what Geiger's doing is he's kind of mapping or conceptualizing like co-production of the past in shaping kind of the future co-productive dynamic of Judaism and Christianity in his own milieu, in which he is embedded, right? And in particular, I was quite inspired by the discussion in your perspectives at the end of the kind of the modern imbrication of the philological, the historical, and theological. I think Geiger and his work are kind of a through line from the past to the present in this regard. Beyond this, and getting to Zunz, Geiger is also part of this larger movement in his time to establish a canon of rabbinic literature that's worthy of serious scholarly investigation, right? It's certainly not accidental that Geiger is the younger contemporary of Zunz, who's considered the founder of the academic study of Judaism in Germany, in particular, famous for his studies of rabbinic Jewish tradition, right? Especially the Midrash. Geiger's work on Quranic stories draws heavily on the Midrash as the place one naturally finds the original Jewish templates for much of the material in the Quran, right? And I'd argue that part of the agenda here is that Geiger is using the Quran to demonstrate the importance of studying the Midrash in a close way. Moreover, in asserting that much of the Quran is based in the Midrash, then what happens is that the Quran functions as a witness to the larger cultural significance of late antique Judaism, right? Now, the problem in all of this is that, the problem in all of this is that Geiger tends to assume that when he sees something in a Jewish source, it must be early and original, right? And when he sees something in the Quran, it is derivative. The reason this is a problem is that, as Zunz already recognized right before Geiger, significant amounts of material in the Midrashic corpus is quite late, right? Later than the Quran itself. And to me, it's extremely significant that one of the Midrashic works that Geiger cites repeatedly is Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, right? It's a widely studied Midrashic collection available in numerous editions already in Geiger's time. Geiger cites traditions from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer as inspiring passages from the Quran, but today we now realize that the PRE is produced in the 8th century at the absolute earliest, right? At least 150 years after the death of Muhammad. Zunz wrote about Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer as if it was post-Islamic, so did, I believe, Hirschfeld. But Geiger generally treats the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer as a source for traditions that are impacting the Quran. So we have a lot of grounds for critiquing Geiger today, but the anachronism of his approach is one of the most obvious. And here I've been led to believe that members of the seminar have read my book, so this will just be a really quick overview of what I think are the most important themes. One of the most striking examples that Geiger cites in what did Muhammad borrow from Judaism is this case of the supposed Jewish influence on the magical golden calf of Surah 20. The Bible, of course, depicts the golden calf worshipped by the Israelites as a mere idol, right? A lifeless golden statue. But both Jewish and Islamic tradition portray the calf as having been brought to life by means of magic. Geiger argues on the basis of both the tafsir, Islamic Quran commentaries, and certain midrashic texts, most notably Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, that the magically animated calf, this is the true meaning of the Quranic story, right? That's ultimately drawing on the midrash. In my book, I've demonstrated that this is just not true, right? The calf in the Quran is not depicted as magically animated. This story of the animation of the calf is only to be found in Islamic traditions about the story, right? And in a handful of Jewish traditions. And the key point is that the parallel Jewish tradition that Geiger identifies as the source of the Quran, this is not the source of either the Quranic story or the later Islamic versions, right? It seems quite clear that the handful of Jewish traditions on the animation of the calf are themselves derived from the tafsir, from later Islamic versions of the calf narrative found in the Quran. Which is to say that not only did Geiger misunderstand the relationship between the Jewish and Islamic narratives about the animation of the calf, he projects this whole scene, the whole idea of the animation of the calf, back onto the Quran, right? And this, in my book, I argue that this has led scholars to misinterpret the Quranic story for about 200 years, okay? So the key point is that the path of development of the calf narrative is not Bible, Midrash, Quran, Tafsir, but rather Bible, Quran, Tafsir, Midrash, right? And here, and maybe in the Q&A, I talk more about like the original genesis of my project, which was actually to try to write a straightforward history of interpretation of the traditions on the calf, but really emphasizing kind of the Geiger frame, Bible, Midrash, Quran, Tafsir. And it was only in the process of doing my initial dissertation research that I realized that Geiger and other observers had gotten the chronology of development wrong. And this was what eventually led me to attempt to, to school myself into becoming a scholar of 19th century intellectual currents in Europe, which was not at all my original project, but I ended up have done a lot of deep dive into Geiger and his legacy, specifically because of an interest in trying to understand how scholars came to not understand the nuances of the chronology of narrative development here. Maybe I'm not a very good 19th century intellectual historian, but it was a kind of a necessary development of the project. Another example, just to flesh this out a little bit. Another example here is furnished by the Quranic Cain and Abel story, right? I have an article on this that came out in the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association last year, maybe 2 years ago. Famously, the Quran adds this weird, puzzling detail to the biblical story, right, of the first murder. The Quran says that Cain or at least insinuates that Cain learns to bury Abel by watching a raven that is sent by God, who scratches in the ground, right? And then Cain buries Abel by imitating the scratching in the ground of the raven. Now, Geiger asserts quite directly, and some scholars after him as well, that the story in the Quran is taken from the version found in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, there are actually two ravens, right? And one is portrayed killing and burying the other one, right? So the bird has become a fratricide mirroring Cain. This is also found in Midrash Tanhuma, which is the version that I've quoted here on the slide. Geiger's claim of Jewish priority, again, here is once again anachronistic. My argument is that the Quran basically originates the story about the raven, where there's one raven, right? Muslim commentators, for various reasons, develop the story and come up with the notion of there being two ravens, right? This is then taken over into later Midrashic works, including Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. Here on the slide, I'm citing the summary of Baidawi, from dating to the 14th century, but the Islamic story of the two ravens is quite early, I would argue. And it's so widely known in the Muslim sources that it's not surprising to find that eventually percolates into Jewish sources like Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer and Midrash Tanhuma. So again, the big takeaway here is the Quran is ultimately the source of the Midrashic story and not the other way around. Overall, so many of the Jewish traditions that Geiger sees as shaping the Quran are actually later than they've previously been assumed to be, right? And so they cannot furnish influences on the Quran at all. At least some of these Jewish traditions represent direct Midrashic responses to Islamic tradition, right? To put it very, very starkly, they're evidence of Islamic influence on Judaism and not the other way around, although, of course, I try to problematize the whole idea of influence. But really nothing so challenging to Geiger's influence paradigm than demonstrating that the chronology actually runs in the opposite direction, right? Not from Jewish sources to the Quran to early Islam, but rather from the Quran to early Islam to the Jewish sources. Scholars use the term Islamicate quite widely now to refer to the culture of Jews and Christians living under Islamic rule, right, and heavily influenced by the dominant Arab Islamic culture. So I've coined the term Islamicate Midrash in reference to these later works that often seem to reflect the impact of Islam on Judaism. I'm happy to talk. It's one of my favorite topics. I'd love to talk more about it in Q&A. So in moving towards a conclusion, right, the question that has to be addressed is, how is Geiger's project plausibly conceived as Islamic, right? As I mentioned before, traditionally minded Muslims would see the approach of Geiger and other Orientalists as antithetical to Islam, right? Denying the divine origin of the Quran and not only attributing it to Muhammad, but actually claiming that Muhammad got it all from his Jewish neighbors, right? But of course, it's natural that Muslims deny the idea of the human source or sources for the Quran, And it's natural that non-Muslims expect or consider that to have been the case, right? This is a basic epistemological problem that's not going to be solved. So to me, we just have to leave this criterion of difference aside. Apart from that, I think we can consider Geiger's approach to be Islamic in a couple of different ways, or at least characterize it as Islamic for a couple of different reasons. First of all, Geiger is extremely reliant on Islamic sources for his readings of the Quran, particularly histories and Quran commentaries. So much so that it's pretty fair to say that the lens through which Geiger views the origins of Islam is a Muslim one, even though he ultimately reaches different conclusions than Muslims would. In the same way that he sees rabbinic tradition monolithically, as uniformly representing an early and original religious vision, right? Geiger sees the Quran and Islamic tradition monolithically as well, right? He does not seem to realize that when he reads Quran commentaries, right, that's telling him what later Muslim commentators thought the Quran meant, and not what the Quran meant in its original historical context. And to me, this is super weird because Geiger would readily have recognized that later Christian commentators had completely changed and distorted the view of the historical Jesus. But he doesn't bring this kind of lens to seeing to the Quran and Islam. Some of Geiger's anachronisms are really stupendous. And what to me, it seems like this is a function of his common reliance on citations of sources that are preserved in anthologies and encyclopedias. Right? He cites a number of classic works by luminaries of the older Orientalist tradition, Marachi, Sister Sassi, Huttinger, Pocock, D'Herbelot, the list goes on and on, going back to the Enlightenment. Okay, and recently what I've been trying to think about is, it seems to me that when Geiger so frequently taps into Islamic tradition, like citing Muslim sources in these anthologies and these editions, encyclopedias, he doesn't have any knowledge of their original context. He has no way to be sensitive to their original context. And then that contributes to his own tendency to make arguments without paying attention to context, right? That the decontextualization is itself a reflex of the way that he's forced to read his sources. He does, in fact, use three primary sources extensively, and this is Baghawi, Abul Fida, and Baidawi. I could talk more about this, but these three sources in particular are repeatedly cited in manuscripts that he knew. Other than that, his reliance on Islamic sources is almost always secondhand. This brings me to another point about the Islamic underpinnings of Geiger's approach, and this is an issue that's, I think, kind of easy to overlook because it's so fundamental, so basic. Geiger, like so many other major Orientalist scholars from the 19th century up to the present day, is anchoring the Quran in the life of Muhammad, right? And because recently there's been some very interesting critique of the profound but until recently unnoticed or unremarked impact of Noldika, in particular, the Theodor Noldika, in shaping and constraining Quranic studies in the Western Academy. Noldika who's born in 1836, dies in 1930, a younger contemporary of Geiger. Noldika publishes the other great foundational work in Quranic studies of the 19th century, the Geschichte des Korans, in 1860. This is the standard textbook on Quranic studies for 100 years, right? Only relatively recently have scholars sought to break away from the Noldika paradigm. Some people actually refer to it as the Noldekian view. Noldika's view is also strongly based in Islamic sources, as has been repeatedly pointed out. Noldika is very dependent on the Itqan of Suyuti, which is, which is a 15th, 16th century textbook on the Quran written by this major Muslim polymath. You read Noldika and you very much get the sense that to understand the Quran in its style, contents, message, framing, all of this has to be understood by looking at the life of Muhammad, right? This is the fundamental view of Muslim commentators, and Noldika imports this view directly into Quranic studies as the major frame that's adopted by Orientalism. Geiger is basically doing exactly the same thing a generation before Noldika, right? Reading the massive amount of biblical, Jewish, Christian material in the Quran as reflecting Muhammad's direct personal engagements with informants in Jewish and Christian communities, right? He's also reading that borrowed material as shaped by Muhammad's personal concerns and agendas. Geiger and Orientalists see Muhammad himself as shaping the Quran. Muslims conventionally see God as doing the shaping, but either way, right? Muhammad and his experience are the key to interpreting the Quran. And in that, again, in that sense, I would argue Geiger is deeply Islamic in some sense. Okay, so really moving to my conclusion now, right? It's hard to summarize all of this in a concise way. Geiger's legacy is still with us today in both more conspicuous and more subtle ways. The influence paradigm, I think, is kind of easier for us to critique today because of the reductive, simplistic way he approaches the question of Muhammad's debt to his Jewish informants, right? He sees the Jews of Arabia as an island of learning and civilization in the literal and metaphorical desert of the Jahiliyyah, pagan pre-Islamic Arabia. In one passage in particular, he talks about how, although the Jews of Arabia were among the most ignorant of the Jews of their time, they nevertheless preserved some kernels of truth from their ancient ancestral traditions, which, this is a quote, which doubtless gave these Jews an appearance of intellectual superiority in those dark times and regions of ignorance, right? They see, which is to say, basically, the Jews of Arabia are dumb, but they're brilliant compared to their savage polytheistic neighbors. This is an attitude that recurs in various ways among Geiger's followers for over a century. This is obviously, more than a little chauvinistic, but to me, the real problem here is that because Geiger sees the Quran and later Islamic tradition as all one, right? The notion of Jewish priority that he's emphasizing, this leads him to see Jews as perpetually superior, perpetually the donors, right? Judaism is fully formed and invulnerable to outside influences at the time of the rise of Islam, and Arabs and Muslims are kind of perpetually inferior, right? They're perpetual borrowers. Their own culture is not really a culture at all, right? And as I think I've shown, this is clearly not correct, right? This is not what's going on. Either when we look at like early Islam and the interactions between Jews and Muslims there, but even like looking at the Quran, which is by and large not as strongly indebted to rabbinic tradition as Geiger asserted. Finally, in brief, there are other ways to conceive of the background to the Quran and the underlying dynamics of cultural transmission that shape the Quran's presentation of biblical and Jewish material. In my Golden Calf book, I argue the Quran reflects a close relationship with both Judaism and Christianity that really cannot be explained by ascribing Quranic material to an otherwise unlearned Arab merchant who's casually borrowing oral traditions from his Jewish neighbors. We cannot today offer a cogent alternative model for the emergence of the Quran, but it's obvious that the influence paradigm doesn't really account for the depth and nuance and sophistication of the Quran. This leads me and a host of other people to again see the traditional account of the Muhammad as the revealer or author of the Quran. This is basically kind of myth, right? I'm not one who would argue that Muhammad didn't exist or that his leadership wasn't fundamental to the emergence of Islam. I do believe in a historical Muhammad, but I think when we look at the Quran, we have to consider other processes and dynamics at play in the formation of the canon. And in doing this, we need to set aside the supposed personal genius of Muhammad and his skill in repurposing the material that he's borrowing from Jewish neighbors. Most of the Quran reflects, it seems, a complex relationship with a variety of late antique precursors, right? And these relationships are so complex and so varied that attributing all this material to Muhammad, his individual religious creativity, this is just not realistic to me. In closing, I'd argue that, or point out that a small but growing number of scholars are proposing a rather different approach to the Quran, one that approaches it as a composite corpus that develops similarly to other scriptures, right? Not necessarily the product of a single person's prophetic activity over the course of a mere 20 years. A handful of scholars, most recently Stephen Shoemaker and Guillaume D., argue that there is a core of early material in the Quran that we might associate with an apocalyptic prophet preaching in Arabia, a Muhammad figure. But some parts of the Quran purportedly originate and are integrated into the scripture at a later phase of development. when the Muslim community had expanded into neighboring territories in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, where Jewish and Christian traditions were Arabized, linked to the career of the prophet, and then incorporated into what became his scripture. Now, I don't agree with this, okay, but this is one view, right? But in thinking about a kind of source critical approach to the Quran, I actually have thought in these lines, but maybe in the opposite direction. I would suggest that maybe that when we think about the emergence of the Quranic corpus, right, the historical Arabian prophet is not the beginning of the process, right, and then like Quranic material is adumbrated later and then integrated into what becomes the corpus. I would actually argue that we can isolate three strata of material in the Quran that probably predate the historical prophet, and we can then identify the historical prophet as an editor redactor figure, right, who collects and adapts these older traditions that had been in circulation in pre-Islamic Arabia for some time. I would emphasize that in identifying these three different kinds of material that seem to come together in the Quran, my criterion is specifically to look at the ways in which the Quran is engaging with precursor traditions. Okay, so sometimes, just speaking very broadly, sometimes it seems the Quran is engaging with Jewish and Christian legends, they're circulating orally, right, and these traditions are adapted in a very kind of rudimentary way. Other times, the Quran seems to more skillfully appropriate and reinterpret Jewish and Christian materials of a liturgical nature, specifically, presumably then encountered in a church and synagogue environment. And then in other cases, I would argue the Quran really does seem to reflect the reworking of actual literary documents, whether oral. I mean, I'm not that concerned with oral versus written, but it does seem like there's this kind of library of late antique sources that the Quranic author is engaging and rewriting. But my main point with all this is that Geiger's, I think, legacy in the way that we approach the Quran today is not just a simplistic notion of borrowing, right, as the way we account for the Quran's links to other monotheistic traditions, but it's also this overwhelming emphasis on Muhammad as the source and focus of the Quran, right? Scholars have more readily dismissed the former, right, gotten rid of the kind of simplistic notion of borrowing, but getting past the latter tendency, right, the emphasis on Muhammad as the source, this is still a constraint on research that I think we're still kind of challenging and working through in maybe a tentative experimental way. And so, final word is that reading your prospectus on co-production, right? I think that for me, what I would see myself doing is that kind of reconceptualizing the Quran as the product of editorial redactional process, right? So thinking of Muhammad as a redactor, this is, I think, my own way of trying to concretize the implications of a lot of contemporary research on the Quran that would contextualize it in the late antique environment as the result of co-production, right? The model implies that the Quran is the result of a longer evolutionary process or a developmental path, right, that involves the co-production of scriptural traditions in this kind of atmosphere of monotheization that I think probably took centuries and not just decades, going probably back to the 4th century, and I can talk about that more. I feel I should stop here, so I'm going to stop. Thank you for listening. I hope that was transparent, and I'm sure there are going to be probing and complex questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. That was so interesting. I have many questions, and as the moderator, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first one, at least. And my task is to decide which one, but no, I know which one I'm going to ask first. And then just as a reminder, as questions occur to you as we continue our discussion, please just you can either put your name in the chat. Even if you just put a period in the chat, I'll take that as you marking your name. And then I see Fred has his hand raised.
Should I be watching the chat as well?
No. I'll do that. You don't have
to.
You just focus on answering the questions. I'll make sure that everything's in order. Oh, good. Excellent. We have 2 questions already, but I'm still going to retain my privilege and ask. So I love the concrete and constructive final paradigm that you offered at the very end of this presentation of the sort of diffusionist strata, the oral performative strata, and then the sort of Quranic library strata of this.
Probably too schematic. I openly acknowledge probably too schematic, but in my article that I'm trying to I make it clear that this is very tentative.
Yeah, but we need a roadmap to use, right? Like, as we actually discussed when discussing your book, like, all knowledge comes from prior knowledge. We have to start somewhere. And I think this is like a very potentially productive starting point. And so my question for you would be, imagine a new source of funding came in, someone asked you to write a new article or book, but you had to do it on a part of the Quran that you had not yet studied. How do you think you would sort of like take the first steps basically in trying to figure out whether a particular part of the Quran was a result of this either like diffusionist, oral performative, or sort of Quranic library model?
Oh,
Yeah.
wow, Jill.
I'm sorry.
That's a fantastic. That's a fantastic question, but it feels like the kind of question you should send me ahead of time. What would my criterion be? Well, I will tell. Let me attack the question this way. I did not invent the strata, right? In thinking about this, for me, and to be honest, like, and here I would say that, like, so Stephen Shoemaker is a good friend of mine, and we often email each other, and we often kind of get in these like email fights because we have very different views. I'm also good friends with Juan Cole, who some of you have read his biography of Muhammad. He has a very different approach to like how you resolve these questions. I think talking to people like them, I come to realize, yeah, I don't know what to think. I don't. If anything, this comes out of my frustration with the complexity of work on the Quran over the last decade or so, combined with my first one. Okay, let me step back for a second. Okay, mentally very excited. Your question is really, really provocative. Okay, so something I've written about is that there's been this amazing advance in work on the Quran over the last 10, 15 years, but there hasn't been a corresponding advance in historiography. I mean, there are all these things happening in the study of pre-Islamic Arabia, the arena, the larger kind of like late antique world. But as of at least a few years ago, I found that scholars of the Quran very seldom tapped into that work. They didn't try to embed their insights on the Quran into our evolving knowledge of the actual environment in which Islam emerged. And so there's this disconnect, this gap, right? That there's people out there writing positivistic history, but there's this weird agnosticism because nobody wants to try to account for how the thing they're writing actually came to be, right? And I found this so puzzling, right? Like all this work on like Syriac literary subtext in the Quran. Well, how does that work? Like, what is your actual opinion on how that actually occurred? And of course, nobody knows, or no one will say. And I was very frustrated by the lack of attempt to resolve these questions. Okay, and in talking to people who have very different views from myself, in looking at recent work, I came to realize that there are these kind of trends. And then I started thinking about, well, it seems like there's so many different kinds of explanations for material that's in the Quran. Maybe it can't all be resolved with a single kind of unified theory, right? And then I came to realize maybe that's the argument for composite authorship. That when you so this bit with the strata comes from an article that I have forthcoming in Studies in Late Antiquity, God willing, sometime. Well, it would have to be next year. Obviously, I just realized it's November. That in adumbrating his theory of like strata, this came from looking at larger trends, and in particular, there's a prevailing view that say Sidney Griffith, right? Bible in Arabic, right? Famously, the Bible is everywhere and nowhere in the Quran. Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at Surah 26, which is my example, and like Griffith's Surah 26, the poets, right? Yeah, there's a certain kind of Quranic retelling of biblical material, which seems like it comes from this kind of like oral diffusionist environment. But then you read like Angelica Neuwirth, and it's quite clear from Angelica's work that there's much more than just kind of simple appropriation and rehashing of legends, right? That to me, the huge takeaway from Neuwirth is that the Quranic mind, such as it is, we can speak of a Quranic mind, whoever's mind that is, the Quranic mind is very perceptive, very sophisticated, and understands what Jews and Christians are doing when they reinterpret biblical topoi, and the Quran is strategizing, deliberately appropriating, and then recasting materials in this kind of, I don't want to say insidery, but with an understanding of how Jews and Christians understand their own material, which cannot be reconciled with Griffith, right? And then there's also work that's recently been done by that's basically focusing on, like reception history, like redactional history. I was really struck by Guillaume D's work in this vein, where he has some very compelling arguments specifically pertaining to Jesus material, where you see that there's a redactional history that's embedded in the Quran, and the obvious implication is that material is being received and recast in kind of literary form. And so in talking about the three strata, this was not my specific heuristic looking at the Quran itself, although I do have some ideas about the Kaf material and where it lies in this. It was more an attempt to look at and interpret the field of Quranic studies and reconcile the unreconcilable, right? Irreconcilable. Like, what if all of these different explanatory mechanisms can all be true? What if these different explanatory mechanisms actually represent the redactional history of the Quran? This is kind of what I'm getting at, and I'm very transparent about this in my article on kind of a source critical approach, that we can reconcile the different hypotheses about specific Quranic material by thinking about the thing as a corpus. And I think Guillaume says this as well. Actually, if you look at all of like a lot of the recent kind of revisionist stuff, that the term corpus is really being emphasized as saying this is a collection of material, right? Shoemaker says the Quran is a late antique apocryphon, right? But this is what lies behind this. So I would need more time to think about the question you just posed me. Although if anyone wants to invite me to write like a book like this, I'm available. I'm open to funding for another groundbreaking project. So,
Excellent.
shameless. I'm sorry.
We're all looking for funding in various ways. That's very
Right?
fascinating. And now, but the line has built up. So now I want to turn to Fred, because he was the first person to raise his hand.
Hey, Fred.
Oh, and you're still muted.
I need to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Actually, I raised my hand by mistake. I meant to simply applaud. But since I have the floor, I will make a short comment. Thank you for your paper. I really enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot from it. I think it's definitely something you want to pursue further, and I hope you get that big funding for another project. One of the things you talk about is a lot, or you mentioned several times, especially in talking about Geiger, is the question of sincerity, that Geiger said, well, yes, the prophet Muhammad wasn't a charlatan, as people had often said, but he was sincere in his effort to spread a message. One thing you don't talk about, though, and I think I know why, because I think you just answered my question, actually. You don't talk about the question of Muhammad's originality. Now, maybe that's because if this is a collective work, the role of Muhammad is much less. But nonetheless, when we look at the Quran, there are many Quranic passages that draw on what we might call biblical material, retelling of narratives, or referring to narratives from the Hebrew Bible. But when it does that, it doesn't just retell the narrative. It often doesn't actually retell it. It refers to it. But it often seems to be taking the narrative and giving it a new spin. That is, it's like he's saying, you people have a theological position that is wrong, and this is the way you should be construing it. So that suggests to me a real originality. I mean, he's making an original contribution into these theological debates. Now, if this text is not, the Quran is not actually the product of one person, but of many people, it becomes a little harder to understand how there could be a coherent alternative theology being presented by this text. But maybe the final redactor, if Muhammad's the final redactor, as you say, maybe that would explain it. Anyway, I'd welcome some comments on that issue of originality and where we might place it. Thank you.
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Fred. Another fantastic, challenging question. Yeah, I mean, I guess okay, so let me start by talking about redactor, right? And here, so I did my master's at Harvard, mostly in Hebrew Bible, Jewish studies. My mentor is John Levinson. John Levinson wrote a book on historical higher criticism of the Bible. In particular, he would sometimes summarize, and this is not original to him, but he sometimes summarized like the German higher criticism as the higher anti-Semitism. that German Protestant scholarship on the Bible in particular is motivated by an idea to show that there is this original vision of Israel that is then corrupted in the process through being channeled through Judaism, right? And in particular, that the fact that there are redactive seams in the Pentateuch in particular shows that the redactor is no good. And in Levinson's memorable phrase, the redactor is not a nudnik. To me, the redactor is never a nudnik, right? There is artistry in redaction for sure. So if the historical Muhammad is the final redactor, that is by no means meant to disparage his creative role. I think the problem is that when you're talking about this stratigraphic view, we have no idea where to place the originality, right? It's clear that there's material in the Quran that itself, that as we have it, reflects an original vision. I mean, this was the point of my calf work. That like my big takeaway about the Surah 20 calf narrative was that it alluded to Jewish, it was like there's an awareness of Jewish and Christian exegetical trends, but the Quran is engaging Exodus 32 in a creative, novel way. Probably, I argued, informed in some way by Ethiopic retellings in particular, though I can't entirely prove it. That was my sense of it. But yeah, where in the stratigraphic history does the originality lie? I would argue that the originality lies in all three strata, right? And in particular, like, I mean, this is what strikes me about Angelica's work, is that like when Neuwirth sees the Quranic contribution as positive and sophisticated, and to me, this is me just mirroring her view on this, that I cannot accept a view of the Quran as being like inferior or garbled. I mean, this was the view that was so common, like in older Orientalism. In fact, I will divulge to this audience that one of the reader reports that came from Oxford before the publication of my book, in one of the reader reports, the reader specifically said, I feel that Pregill gives too much credit to the Quranic author, that not everything in the Quran reflects originality, sophistication. Sometimes the Quran just makes mistakes. There's stuff in the Quran we can't understand, and it's just because it's wrong. And this just seems to me like to be not a not very helpful perspective. As in all the other reader reports I have gotten over the years, where people say, by and large, the Quran borrows from the Midrash, and there's really no point in making a big deal out of this. So yeah, the originality issue, I would want to think about that more. Geiger was certainly, of course, critiqued in his own time for not giving enough credit to the originality of the prophet. And I would say, and something I acknowledge in my book as well, that like going back to like already like Johann Fuchs, right? Like there's this like argument that like the Quran is this original synthesis of these different elements. And I think that's by and large a view that prevails today and a view that I would endorse. I'm just trying to bring a different kind of light to the kind of prehistory that informs the formation of the redaction of this corpus.
Thank you.
Excellent. Our next question is from George Tomer.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. Glad to see you again after so many years. I'm not going to discuss with you the issue of co-authorship, the Quran. We can spend hours talking about the context in which the Quran has emerged, but I would make here a short footnote to your presentation regarding the context of Abraham Geiger's interpretation. His positive view of Muhammad as a sincere prophet was not a creation ex nihilo. It was actually in the German context of the Romantic, in the beginning with Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, going to Friedrich Rückert, who started translating the Quran in 1826 and using his poetic genius in order to transmit the Quran into German in a poetic language. And there is another scholar who is a contemporary of Abraham Geiger and who played a major role in the development of Quranic studies. It's Gustav Weil, who suggested the chronology which Nöldeke took and refined and developed in his Geschichte des Koran. So that's the German context of the first half of the 19th century. And among Orientalists, we have similar developments. Just to mention Reiske, one of the leading Orientalists in Germany, who stopped looking at Muhammad as an impostor and gave him his right as a prophet who was sincere in bringing the divine messages to his people. So it's the whole context. It was in the air, and Abraham Geiger was a part of this context in the German-speaking language in Germany and in Austria.
Thank you, Professor. Nice to see you again as well. No, I readily admit I streamlined this for the sake of presentation. Yes, absolutely. And in particular, I think so for example, like Alexander Bevilacqua in his study was the Republic of Arabic Letters. I think he actually emphasizes the Enlightenment as the transformative period. I mean, I guess I would just and I do recognize that there are precursors to Geiger, right? What I guess I'm trying to emphasize is that the originality of Geiger's contribution is in implementing these views in a way that was so widely disseminated. You know what I mean? That because Geiger had essentially what we would call the chops, as it were, to demonstrate the rabbinic basis of the Quran in particular, his work was the point at which this more positive view was percolated out. But yes, absolutely would acknowledge that there were others who were precursors to this, other contemporaries as well, which helps to explain why his work had such a rapid impact, I think. But Geiger, I think, has a specific importance as the touchstone for this theme of sincerity as it radiates outward, right? And of course, in my project, what I'm trying to really think through is how that theme of like that positive view of Geiger or positive view of Muhammad in Geiger, what work is that doing for Geiger as a Jewish thinker? And then how does that impact the way that we think about the Quran afterwards? But yes, your point's absolutely acknowledged. Yes.
Excellent. Our next question is from Aysun Yassar.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I'm actually working about Ignaz Goldziher, one of his famous students of Abraham Geiger, and seen as one of the founders of Islamic studies or the modern Islamic studies. One of my questions is, did Abraham Geiger call Muhammad as a reformer? Because in Ignaz Goldziher, we see that he says Muhammad is not a prophet, but he's a reformer. And as you've said, they're projecting their ideas or wishes into Muhammad. And I think, yeah, Goldziher is in between orthodoxy and assimilation in the 19th Jewish community in the context. And so he is not far away from projecting his wishes, ideas of being reforming Judaism, and thus reflecting his ideas into Muhammad. Do you have hints that Abraham Geiger does use this method as well? This is my first question. And the second question is, I was fascinated when I read the diary of Ignaz Goldziher, because he was a pious Jew. And he performed the prayer with Muslims. He had a strong empathy. So could you observe this way of empathy in Abraham Geiger as well? Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for these questions. Yeah, and to address them in reverse order. Yes, and of course there's that famous episode of Geiger at the of Goldziher at the Azhar, right? This has been written about it in a number of sources. Like Hamid Dabashi, when Goldziher was translation of Goldziher was republished in English with a new edition. Hamid Dabashi talks about Goldziher as this kind of bridge figure in various ways, and he specifically emphasizes Goldziher's great sympathy for for Islam and these encounters that he had when he was in Egypt. Muhammad as reformer is tricky in Geiger because, first of all, what if Muhammad is reform? I mean, he generally, yes, you could argue that he does. You do see the glimmerings here that like Muhammad is trying to like innovate in some way in bringing a new religious consciousness into a world in which there isn't one. This, I think, is a stronger in Geiger's successors, insofar as for Geiger, if Muhammad is a reformer, what that means is essentially that he is just implementing that kind of reformist spirit that he sees already in Judaism, right? That he sees as kind of bringing this forward. So in that sense, what Muhammad stands for, again, is as a witness to the vitality of Judaism. I don't see Geiger as really interested in vindicating Islam on any profound level. I think that for I mean, this is something that has to be nuanced, of course, but I think that for Geiger, when he's talking about the relationships, he's really thinking here Muhammad is more like a witness, you know, and this reformist thing comes forward, I think, like later on, where and it reaches its kind of pinnacle, and like, you know, Watt, right? Corona criticized Watt as trying to kind of create this vision of Muhammad as this kind of like socialist revolutionary, right? These are a little bit latent there, but I think Geiger has other agendas. Great question, though. Thank you.
Excellent. Our next question is from David Gyllenhaal.
Hey, thanks so much for the talk and also all the material of yours that we've read. I really, really like the decision to sort of step outside the kind of haze of agnosticism that has settled over kind of the question of Quranic origins. And I quite like your sort of stratigraphic model, but I wanted to prod you a little bit about the issue of tafsir and how it does or doesn't fit into your approach. Because sort of the historiographical case that you've laid out both today and in your book for sort of the fact that actually a lot of Western Quranic scholarship has been filtered through tafsir ends up becoming a mandate to kind of like sweep the decks clear of tafsir, which I think does open up interesting possibilities for your work, and it's sometimes really effective. But I also wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's potentially lost there as well. Because I mean, one thing that's kind of striking if you get into the tafsir corpus is how rapidly pretty important cruxes in the Quran become deeply obscure to the authors of tafsir. And it's kind of weird. Like, why do so many things get so mysterious so quickly? And I can definitely see a sort of potential version of your argument that takes that as support for a relatively early sort of process of editorial revision of a diverse set of materials. I mean, it's a little bit easier to reconcile the sort of sudden obscurity of a lot of really important Quranic cruxes to tafsir authors with your model than it is with, say, you know, like this thing didn't really crystallize until the reign of Abdul Malik, which is, I guess, the most hardline revisionist position on offer. So that's a somewhat vague question, but I guess I just want you to talk a little bit more about what you think tafsir may or may not be able to do for your project on its current age.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. Great question. Yeah, I feel that I have, in my career, I have often advocated for, you know, advancing a historical, critical work, comparative, contextualist work on the Quran in a non-polemical spirit, right? And there's so much work of that stuff that's done that I think that has these kind of problematic implications, or sometimes like advanced in a polemical or at least kind of callously dismissive fashion. I very much do not want anyone to get the idea that I do not think Islamic tradition is important. I also advocate for the importance of tafsir studies. But for me, yeah, these are clearly two different enterprises, right? And when we look at Geiger and his work, we can see that that's very clear. Again, amazingly, again, for him, it's not, he doesn't recognize that there is this kind of gap between the Quran and the tradition. even though that's the major, like the leitmotif of his work on Jesus, right? So somehow this doesn't transfer, right? The issue of the gap, right? The interpretive gap, right? This is a little bit, to me, it's a little bit overstated in the sense that I often try to emphasize that it's not so much that exegetes didn't know what the Quran meant, it's that they selected other options, right? Or the tradition thought that certain questions were more interesting, whereas historical, critical, contextual reading of the source that we attempt to do as modern scholars, that was, of course, not on their radar or on their plates, right? That was not what they were doing. Kauthar, right? Kauthar is the obvious example, right? Kauthar as plenitude is lost or it becomes like a very obscure, and then Kauthar as a river in heaven it becomes the dominant view. And this is one that people kind of trot out. In my own work on the calf, for example, what I argued essentially what was lost was that the Quranic version of the calf narrative is very carefully and very strategically weighing in on Jewish and Christian arguments over the revelation at Sinai, the prophethood of Moses, the role of Aaron, and the idolatry of Israel. Right, and that first idolatry of Israel as a paradigmatic idolatry that then recurs. The Quran is entering the fray of arguments about this, but the Quran, again, just for the Quranic mind, that's just a shorthand. The Quran knows, if the Quran can know things, the Quran knows that Aaron is the maker of the calf. The Quran casts Aaron as the maker of the calf, but there is this issue of Samiri, right? Referring to him as I argue, as a Sumerian, right? The founder of Sumerian worship, kind of like the Sumerian worship of Jeroboam, right? Clearly like some very nuanced understanding of like the biblical backstory here. In the tafsir, Samiri is always another person, right? He's like this other individual. There are these wide debates over the animation of the calf. Is the calf really alive? Is it a robot? Is it a living animal? What is the calf? There's some difference of opinion here. And the Mutazila in particular have their way of kind of arguing about this. That's more rationalist, but Samiri is always Aaron. Did they not know that Samiri was actually an epithet for Aaron? I would argue, yeah, well, that might have occurred to them, but that was incomprehensible to them, right? It was incomprehensible to them that the Quran would be casting Aaron, the brother of Moses, as an arch idolater, and so the interpretation moved in a different direction. I've always tried to argue that tafsir is about moving a conversation in a different direction and less about what they knew or what they didn't know. At the same time, historiographically, yeah, it makes sense. The Quran is collated early, disseminated widely. It is quite clear the Quran is disseminated to places in the Islamic Empire where there is no apparatus of scholars to interpret it, right? And so you see we have trouble with this, heterogeneity, diversity. You see diversity in Quran interpretation as a reflex of diversity, the operative diversity in the Islamic Empire, where the Quran was not that well known at the beginning, could not have been well known at the beginning, came to be known in different forms early on, and again, a great diversity in interpretation. I very much want to encourage the study of tafsir. And tafsir is a place where we see fascinating conversations between Jews and early Muslims. And I don't want to flip Geiger completely on his head and say like, no, it's Jews are always siphoning off of Islam. It's not the case. When we look in the early tafsir, we see dialogue, absolutely. But I think for the purpose of trying to correct Geiger, then we step away and say like, okay, well, the Quran is not what the tafsir says it is, and the Quran is not a repository of midrash. Those are the two like major themes of my engagement with the Quran in terms of like involving tafsir in the process. It has a place. I have a whole chapter on Islamic at midrash, but I'm trying to separate these realms, right? Keeping the beams separate. Did I answer your question? A diffuse question gets a diffuse answer.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so in a sense, like your work with the Golden Calf almost has some family resemblances to Shahab Ahmed's work with the Satanic Verses, and that it's a question of, well, the criterion of embarrassment is great, but it changes. What's weird is that it changes over time. Like things become more embarrassing later, and then that has to be retrojected into how it's read out of the Quran as well.
And this is maybe a less obvious influence, as it were. Karen Bauer's work on 434. Karen and I were in grad school at the same time, and the criterion of embarrassment, and not all exegetes are embarrassed by the same things at the same time, right? Which explains the varied evolution of the tafsir tradition, which is wide, capacious, and you can find almost everything in the tafsir tradition. There is a kind of a bias that emerges where we tend to read through Sunni. If you were to simply read the tafsir through, like, say, Tabari, Zamakhshari, Ibn Kathir, you would get a really distorted sense of what the interpretive terrain looked like, right? And so this is something else I've also argued, that I'll probably have a whole other book in me about, like, tafsir and the golden calf and related issues with idolatry. But I mean, there's so much more to Quran interpretation than the tafsir tradition itself anyway, right? You have to move to Shari tradition, you have to look at other genres, and there the field is very diverse on the calf as well. Let me stop there.
All right. The next question is from David Nierenberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for really a terrific talk, and for your book, which we all read and discussed together with great profit. I have a question, maybe, and I also really appreciate your shout outs to the concept of co-production, and to, in some ways, its meta-temporality. And I guess my question is a little bit about how your own project is embedded in a temporality of co-production, the choices you make. So, for example, I think most people on this Zoom would probably grant that the idea that Islam, early Islam, owed something to Judaism is as old as thinking about Islam in non-Muslim circles itself, and in Muslim circles. We already have 7th century texts that treat Islam as a heresy of Judaism. We have, or borrowing extensively from Judaism, and that tradition runs all the way through to the modern period. And we also have, we have texts that treat Muhammad as sincere. I think of Spinoza, I think of Maimonides. There's a lot of texts that treat Muhammad as sincere. So you could pick any starting point, and you picked Abraham Geiger, and I'm not sure why. I mean, so I guess my question would be, if we sat down and did a kind of citation analysis of Abraham Geiger versus Theodor Noldeke in the late 19th century development of German thinking and European thinking about Islam, would we find that Geiger really plays as central a role as you're suggesting? And why pick that figure instead of any of the, does that have something to do with your own place in our present moment of intersectionality in thinking about religious studies? And similarly, even your commitment to Muhammad as redactor. I mean, if we were talking about any other scriptural tradition, we probably wouldn't feel the need to speak about a single person as the redactor. We would think of redaction as a plurilocal and asynchronous process until some moment of canonization. And we could easily think of that about Muhammad too, about the Quran as well. And yet you commit to a certain view of Muhammad, which may be just as much a product of contemporary apologetics and competition as any other view. And so I'm just wondering how you decide whether your view is responding to these kinds of pressures, or how you retain a kind of claim about, I don't want to say objectivity, but I'll just say the plausibility of the foci you're finding.
Wow. Thank you so much for a really complex, nuanced question that I'm gonna have to think about for the next couple of years. Okay, just to break this down, right? So why Geiger and why Muhammad? Right? So why Geiger? So I came to my work on Geiger quite, as I've already noted, kind of backwards, right? I was working on the Quran, right? I was working on the Quranic calf narrative, and it had always been my intention to do like a straightforward linear history of interpretation type study. Actually, for me, my big breakthrough was to talk about the Quran and tafsir with some of the sophistication, God willing, intentional, hoping to write with the sophistication that you see in the study of Midrash. So my master's work was with John Levinson, Yossi Don, who worked on Kabbalah, but like looking at like a contemporary Midrash study and the sophistication with which that is done, I wanted to bring some of that work on those insights into intertextuality to a field in which it seemed like there was not a lot of work on the Quran and its tafsir in particular that was rich in that way. And then at some point working on the narratives, I came to realize that the traditional chronology of narrative of the development of the narratives was backwards. And I just found myself scratching my head wondering, how could this be? Right? And so I simply worked backwards. I read every secondary source I could find, looked at the footnotes, and kept coming back to a couple of things. One was that Geiger was the absolute foundation for works of this sort. And you go back to Speyer. There are certainly people that follow Geiger who are following his footsteps, but Geiger is the first, I think, that his work is the first serious work on the Quran of the 19th century, and it's predating Noldika by a generation. But also, Geiger is the first person to really try to substantiate these claims of Jewish dependence. Right? He knows the tradition because he's a rabbi. He's trained. He has the chops where he can bring those works to bear in a philological way. By our contemporary standards, not a very serious, sophisticated way, but nevertheless, he's bringing the bibliography. He knows the sources, right? And so Geiger is the touchstone for that reason alone. Why Muhammad? I in my forthcoming article about this, I think I make it pretty clear that this is like, Muhammad is purely heuristic. Like this is just like, we've got to call the redactor something. It's impossible for me to believe that Islam, as it comes to expand out into in the process of the Arab conquest, that is clearly the product of some movement in Northwest Arabia, right? The historical Muhammad, there is clearly some sort of founder figure, and that founder figure must have been the conveyor of the Quran to this larger audience. The question is, where did this person or people get that Quran? I have no way of bringing these things together, right? I look at the Quran and I see a complex, redactional stratigraphic history. There is a historical Muhammad who promulgates the Quran and leads this community that then expands out very rapidly. What's the connection? I have no idea. I literally have no idea. I think that the argument, even Stephen Shoemaker, these ultra skeptics will say that there is a stratum in the Quran that clearly is rooted in Arabian preaching, and it seems obtuse to not see that Arabian preacher as the historical Muhammad. I would actually point to an article I found really helpful in this regard. Tommaso Tese has an article called "The Qurans in Context," and he does away with the Meccan Medinan structure and instead, based on other criteria, tries to isolate a body of surahs that he thinks are authentically, Northwest Arabian, that we can associate with Muhammad or a figure like Muhammad. And what's really interesting to me about Tommaso's argument is that he doesn't quite phrase it in this way, but he basically presents it as these are genuine surahs that conform to what the tradition would tell us about pre-Islamic Arabia. It's just that there is all this other material in the Quran that he sees as accreted later. That's not my methodology, but he would concede that there is material in the Quran that seems to suggest a pagan, like an atmosphere of pagan preaching. Shoemaker would say the same thing, but with the apocalyptic focus. What's the connection between historical Muhammad and his preaching and what's in the Quran? I can't explain that. Unsolved mysteries.
All right. Our next question is from Paul Neuenkirchen.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful talk, and also for the really great Golden Calf book, which I really enjoyed. And actually, I just wrote a book review about it, so I will send it your way when it's published. One of the questions that I had has actually just been asked by David Nuremberg, but my question was a little bit more overarching, I guess, because I was kind of wondering, I didn't really understand in your last slide why you would completely dismiss any later redaction of the Quran, any later additions to the Quran after Muhammad's death, because I completely agree that there are definitely earlier materials that predate Muhammad, and as well as materials that are most certainly related to Muhammad in a way or another. But then I don't really see any reason to think that after his death, things just completely stopped, unless, of course, you follow the Sunni Orthodox account of things, which, of course, is just one of many different accounts of what happened after Muhammad's death. And so, when I was like asking myself this question, I was also, of course, led to wonder why, because I feel like this tension when you speak of Muhammad and the Quran, like trying to, on the one hand, kind of dismiss the whole traditional account, but then also trying to reintegrate Muhammad in the center of the Quran, which I think is, of course, kind of problematic, since, the Quran itself does not necessarily acknowledge, well, it actually never really acknowledges Muhammad as part of the Quran. So that was like, yeah, so that was one of my questions. And also just a very quick remark also, because you were talking about Geiger's Islamic approach and how he really heavily relies on tafsir, and especially as regards to this whole polemic and to this whole polemic question regarding informants, for example. But I think, there is, one thing that has, to my mind, been kind of overlooked, which is the Quran itself, which, is the primary source for this polemic. It's not like a Jewish polemic, like a 19th century Jewish polemic against Islam, or a 14th century Christian polemic against Islam. It's something that is found in the Quran itself. So it's something that the Quran acknowledges itself when it speaks, for example, in Surah 16, verse 103, of the human who teaches the author of the Quran. So it does acknowledge this outside interaction with this informant. So it's not something completely made up for polemical reasons afterwards. And I was just wondering what you thought about that also, because since you only spoke about the Muslim tradition, tafsir, etc. So that's about it. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much. more complexity. I'm going to try to keep this all straight in my head. Okay, so fundamentally, when I retain reference to Muhammad, Muhammad for me is just shorthand for Quranic revealer. I'm really not that committed to very, 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 very strongly to a historical Muhammad, except that, again, it just seems to me to be that there was a historical individual who led this community who must have promulgated the Quran. If you like Quranic author, the revealer, that, again, I don't really mean that to imply much more than that. If you're a very perceptive reader, obviously. So if you, I'm sure you go through my work, you'd be like, oh, well, here you're insinuating this. Yes, but for me, primarily, there must be an origin point, right, for the corpus. That it seems, and I guess one of the things I've never quite understood is this: are the late redaction people. Like, if so much of the Quran is late, as some of these people would suggest, like, how do you argue for its authority? You know what I mean? Like, it just seemed to me that most, if not all, of the Quranic corpus must be associated with an authority figure at some point, and it just seems natural to me to associate that with the historical Muhammad, who is perched at the beginning of this process that must have unfolded by and large according to the conventional account. You know what I mean? I find myself wrestling with so many of the debates right now about dating, the inscriptional evidence, epigraphy, paleography, the manuscripts. So much of this is over specialized, right? Stephen Shoemaker wades into this and refutes a lot of this. I don't know. My impression from reading some of this work as a non-specialist, not trained in epigraphy or manuscripts, is that it seems like the consensus is something like the Uthmanic corpus by about 650. This is contested by other people, but it seems to me there's a very strong argument in favor of that. And I'm thinking in particular of Marian van Puten's argument that the language of the Quran is Hijazi Arabic, right? And so I guess what I find harder to believe is that the Quran, the Quranic materials revealed during a time of historical Muhammad, disseminated out into, say, Palestine, Syria, then new material is incorporated into the communal knowledge of the community, and then is Arabized in such a way that stylistically it matches the content that came before. Does the redactional, or is it that the original material that came out of Arabia with the conquerors was in some other linguistic register, like an older form of Arabic, then it was all kind of systematized together in the corpus? You know what I mean? I just don't understand how it's plausible that it all came together so quickly, say between 632 or 634, depending on who you ask, and say about 650. That window is extremely narrow. Guillaume D would acknowledge that. Tommaso Tese would acknowledge that. Stephen Shoemaker would say, probably later than 650. But to me, this seems less plausible than the idea that the Jewish and Christian currents in late antiquity have already made incursions into Arabia and are actually then precipitating some sort of textual tradition that is then oral or written, that is then forming into the Quran, which is then revealed during the period of the activity of the historical Muhammad. You know what I mean? That just seems to me to be more logical in that sense. I guess here I'm really, and so at Columbia, I studied with Richard Bullitt, and he always had this argument that, what we never really seem to imagine is how little early Muslims knew about where they had come from, in the sense of, like, the Quran was not widely distributed, right? It was orally transmitted, but how many people really had the kind of, like, the luxury of learning a significant amount of Quran? This is his argument for why Hadith is so important, because the oral reports are then like the primary way that people understand Islam in the first generations. And so the Quran is something that's very rudimentary. Granted, that rudimentary nature, I guess you could think of as an open canon, but to me that suggests the opposite, that the Quran is actually this kind of artifact that comes out of the Hijaz and then is distributed in a kind of a hokey sort of way. And maybe this actually addresses the question of tafsir, why there's this gap between the original contextual meaning and the later meaning, is because there had been these generations that were separated from the original Hijazi environment. And I've wandered off the topic. So have I addressed your questions? Why Muhammad? Provisional. Late redaction? I don't know. I prefer to think that, sorry, one last bit. Something that we often say, and I mean this, like Tommaso Tese has literally said this. Guillaume D literally says it. Stephen Shoemaker says it in his book. I say this in my article. Either to account for the Quran, the contents of the Quran, either you have to put the Quran outside of the Hijaz, or you have to posit a Hijaz that is radically different from what the tradition tells us. I would opt for the latter. Like the Hijaz, the Arabian environment is much more complex than the tradition would have told us, or at least the tradition generally told us. And the tradition does hint at various things, right? But I prefer kind of a nativist evolutionary view rather than this idea of like a late development of the canon outside of Arabia. I could be wrong. I'm also trying to promote a kind of scholarship which is agnostic, more that acknowledges what we don't know, and I try to be agnostic about these things.
Excellent. So just going to jump in to say we have 2 more questions and about 6 minutes left in this. So I'm going to encourage concision as much as possible with our next question from Mercedes Garcia Arenal.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your terrific seminar and for the discussion afterwards. My question is very concrete. Geiger and the people you are talking about around him or before him, did they ever make some sort of comparison or connection between Muhammad and Jesus? That's it.
Professor, thank you for your question. Nice to see you. I don't know. I have read a lot of Geiger, and I've read a lot of Susanna Heschel, and I'm sure I'm probably wrong, but I would have to say I don't recall ever reading about Geiger making this direct comparison. But maybe I'm just not remembering it. I'm probably wrong. I will look.
Okay, and the last person who had raised their hand was Miriam Frankel. Oh, and Miriam, you're muted right now. Sorry, Miriam, you're muted right now, so we actually can't hear you.
Perhaps she can't hear you.
Maria, could you maybe ask her to unmute with your admin privileges? It might make it easier.
Yeah, so I did.
Oh, there we go.
All right. So thanks a lot, Michael, for your talk and for the book, your book, which I really enjoyed. Still, I believe you should put Geiger in the right proportion and in the right context. He wrote this, not even book, essay, when he was 19. And it was probably the first ever essay that he published. And he wrote in the 19th century, and he wrote at a time when German Jewry went through a very deep identity crisis. In many ways, when he was exploring, studying the Quran and studying Islam, he was looking for his own Jewish sources. So he actually, when he wrote the book, he didn't, I think, this is the way I read Geiger. He actually meant to find the connection and what connects Judaism and Islam. So I believe, first of all, he was not that influential. This was actually a very unripe, perhaps, essay of his. And his aim was totally different. So for us coming at this time in the 21st century and judging him with our very sophisticated tools, I think it's somehow out of proportion. But that's all.
Thank you so much. Interesting. The thing is, you know, again, I did not come to my study of Geiger with a foregone conclusion about his importance. It was simply that as a Quran scholar, if you are specifically interested in these issues of Jewish matrix, right, like this purported Jewish impact on the Quran, and you read back through scholarship, what strikes one about the development of scholarship on specific topoi themes, narratives in the Quran is that when you go backwards, they eventually all cite Geiger. But they're often I would certainly not contest the idea that it is not a mature work of scholarship. But I think what Geiger is trying to do is improve on the situation that, say, presented by somebody like Marachi. Or Marachi is a tremendously learned individual, but yet very, just terribly anachronistic, and then of course disparaging in the way that he cites both like Jewish and Jewish and Islamic material. I think Geiger is trying to like renovate this methodology for a new era. It's the spirit that counts rather than the execution, right? I mean, yeah, absolutely. There are places where Geiger, and again, he was like literally like less than half my age, so I'm not going to scold him. But Geiger really is very often sloppy with the sources. What I'm really trying to get at with Geiger is the way that he sets a tone, and for future Quran scholars are at least using Geiger as the source, the launching pad, especially even when they're refuting him. There is in terms of like maturity and scope and knowledge, of course, like Speyer. I mean, Speyer is probably it's so many things wrong with Speyer's work, but Speyer, I think, is a much more significant contribution to scholarship. And then when you compare them to somebody like Parrett, right? Like there's just no comparison. But my point is just that Geiger sets the stage, and future scholars working on the Quran came to Geiger first. They would see what Geiger had said, and then they would try either corroborate what he had said or refute it. And in particular, the refutations are interesting because there then comes to be, this is something I talk about in the book, that, and maybe a little bit in the CAF book as well, but mostly in my new book, that certainly by the 20th century, certainly by like the middle of the 20th century, that this is like nobody's really taking Geiger all that seriously, but they use his allegations of a Jewish source, and then they start staging these arguments for lost Jewish sources. This is a whole chapter in the history of Quran scholarship that I find fascinating, that there was always this kind of attempt to find things in Geniza text, to find things in Yemenite text, this kind of this constant quest to find this Jewish like source that would explain all of these mysterious cruxes that we find in the Quran. And my overarching argument is that the Quran is more original than we give it credit for. It's often synthesizing diverse things. There's so much that we don't know about the Quran's backstory anyway, but there was this quest to find the Jewish sources. And then what's happening is that these people are like, I think like Ginsburg, Lieberman, like they're finding new sources that are evidence for that later period of symbiosis. They're finding new examples of sources of Jewish authors who are tapping tafsir, who are tapping Islamic learned tradition as their touchstone. This is a whole fascinating chapter that, again, to me, as working as a graduate student about 2003, it was astonishing to me that the way that this history had unfolded with Geiger as the touchstone, and yet the next step was lacking. The next step of saying like, well, okay, all this material is being excavated and brought forward as evidence. Why has it so seldom been the case that people take that material and they actually put it right side up, where we can now understand that, oh yes, this material does stand in a trajectory, but because Geiger put so much emphasis on the Jewish matrix, again following Marachi and the previous tradition, look, why has this not been rectified? My concern was to rectify it.
Wonderful. Well, now we are just a minute or two past 1, and I don't want to impose on anyone's time, but I did want to say thank you so much, Michael, for your work and for this like really interesting discussion. I also wanted to invite everyone here to come to the next open seminar of this series, which is with John C. Reeves on Monday, December 19th, from 9 to 11 Eastern Standard Time, 3 to 5 Central European Time. And the title of his talk is The Making of Enoch from Antiquity to the Middle Ages, the co-production of a scriptural character and a scholarly resource. And you can, if anyone is not yet signed up to our mailing list, you can find that at the bottom of every page of our Co-Produced Religion website, which I will put in the chat now. But until I will see some of you then, hopefully, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your generosity, your amazing questions. Very provocative. I've really, really, really appreciate it. Jill, thanks for the invite. This was fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Michael.